The howling winds of Xylos had become Kale's constant companion. 3 years on this frozen wasteland, and still the metallic shriek of ice crystals battering against reinforced plasteel never ceased to unnerve him. He adjusted the thermal regulators in his cramped monitoring station, watching frost patterns form intricate fractals across the few small viewports not completely covered by protective shutters. Station integrity holding at 89%, chirped Visa, the ancient AI that governed the forgotten seismic monitoring outpost. Her voice, programmed to be soothing, had developed an electronic stutter over decades of neglect. And magnetic storm intensity increasing. I recommend all non-essential systems power down. Thanks for the advice, Kale muttered, his eyes fixed on the readings that scrolled across his primary screen. The magnetic storm brewing outside was unlike any he'd recorded in his exile. Energy patterns spiraled in configurations that defied the models. Something was different. He'd come to Xylos to disappear, to bury himself in obscurity after the mining disaster that had cost 17 lives on Gonox Prime. The corporation had needed a scapegoat, and junior engineer Kale Mercer had been the perfect candidate. He still heard their screams in his dreams. The Universal Mining Guild had revoked his license and blacklisted his credentials across the core systems. The only job he could find was tending this outdated seismic station on the edge of civilized space, monitoring crystal formations that no one really cared about on a planet no one wanted to visit. Xylos had its strange beauty, though. The perpetual aurora illuminated the glacier fields in haunting greens and blues, and a massive crystal rift near the station emitted faint pulses of energy that created phantom echoes in the sky. Scientists had theorized the crystals were remnants of an ancient civilization, but funding for proper archaeological research had dried up decades ago once the initial surveys revealed no immediately profitable applications. The proximity alert suddenly blared, its harsh tone cutting through the relative quiet of the station. Unidentified aerial object detected, Visa announced, her voice glitching more severely under the strain of running multiple systems simultaneously. T-trajectory indicates impact within 500 meters of station perimeter. Kale rushed to the monitoring screen. The magnetic storm had intensified to unprecedented levels, readings off the charts. Through it all, something was falling from the sky, too controlled to be a meteorite, too small for a proper spacecraft. What the hell? He whispered as the object punched through the storm cloud layer and slammed into the ice near the crystal rift, the impact sending vibrations through the station floor. Every instinct told him to lock down the station and wait for the storm to pass. 3 years of exile had taught him caution above all else. But the positioning of the impact, so close to the crystals he'd been monitoring, seemed too coincidental. Visa, prepare an environmental suit, he commanded, already moving toward the station's small airlock. And keep the perimeter defenses active. See compliance registered, Visa responded. External T temperature at minus 78 degrees. S-suit integrity required for survival. 10 minutes later, Kale trudged through knee-deep snow, his environmental suit's heating elements struggling against Xylos's brutal cold. The magnetic storm created disruptions in his suit's systems, causing his heads-up display to flicker erratically. In the distance, the crystal rift glowed with unusual intensity, its normal soft luminescence replaced by pulsing patterns that seemed almost responsive. The impact site came into view as he crested a small ridge of compacted snow. What he found wasn't a meteorite or even a small escape pod, but something else entirely. A crystalline cocoon-like structure had partially embedded itself in the ice, its surface cracked and steaming in the frozen air. As Kale approached cautiously, portions of the structure began to dissolve, revealing what lay within. His breath caught in his throat. Curled within the remnants of the crystalline vessel was a humanoid figure, but clearly not human. The being had the general shape of a woman, but covered in fine white fur with subtle markings in silver and pale blue. Her features were feline, with a delicate muzzle and large, pointed ears now flattened in pain or unconsciousness. Most startling were the biotech implants visible at her temples and along her arms. Not crude mechanical additions, but elegant crystalline structures that seemed to grow from her very flesh. As Kale stood frozen in shock, the being's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises of such deep emerald they seemed to capture the aurora itself. She stared directly at him, her gaze focused despite her obvious injuries. Her lips moved, speaking words in a language of musical clicks and trills he couldn't begin to comprehend. Then, seemingly with great effort, she switched to Galactic Standard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found you at last, Crystal Guardian." Blood matted the white fur around a wound on her side. Before Kale could respond, her eyes rolled back, and she slipped into unconsciousness. Kale stood paralyzed for several heartbeats, the storm raging around him. Every instinct screamed to leave this creature and the complications she would inevitably bring. His life on Xylos was about isolation, about avoiding any entanglement with the wider galaxy. But as the snow began to accumulate on her still form, he cursed under his breath. "Visa," he transmitted through his suit's comm. "Prepare the medical bay." Such as it is. The journey back to the station was arduous. The alien woman cradled awkwardly in his arms. Despite her size, nearly as tall as his own 6 feet, she was surprisingly light, as though her bones were hollow or composed of some lighter material. By the time he reached the airlock, the storm had intensified further, and warnings flashed across his helmet display about suit integrity failing. Inside the station's cramped medical bay, little more than a converted storage room with a diagnostic scanner and basic field medical equipment, Kale gently laid the unconscious being on the examination table. Up close, her injuries looked worse. A deep laceration along her side, burns on her hands and forearms, and a concerning translucency to the crystalline implants that dotted her skin. "Visa, run a bioscan and access any xenobiological databases we might still have access to." He began cleaning the visible wounds with antiseptic, noting that her blood had an unusual iridescent quality, almost luminescent under the harsh medical lights. "Scanning C complete," Visa announced after several minutes. "Physiology partially matches records for species designated Falarian. Limited data available, classified as near-mythical by xenobiologists. No updated entries in over 2 centuries. Falarian," Kale repeated softly, looking at the unconscious alien with new curiosity. He'd heard legends of cat-like beings who navigated the stars without conventional ships, but had dismissed them as spacer tales. What else? "Crystalline structures appear to be symbiotic rather than artificial implants. Recommend avoiding damage to these structures during T treatment. Internal injuries present, but self-healing mechanisms active. Subject severely depleted of energy." As Kale worked to bandage her wounds and set up an intravenous fluid drip calibrated for humanoid physiology, he found himself studying her face. Despite the alien features, there was something hauntingly beautiful about her, a serene dignity even in unconsciousness. The name Lyra came unbidden to his mind, reminded of an ancient constellation from Earth mythology, stars shining in silence. "What the hell did you mean? Crystal Guardian," he murmured as he worked. "And why were you looking for me?" 3 days passed before Lyra, as Kale had begun calling her in his mind, fully regained consciousness. During that time, she drifted in and out of awareness, occasionally murmuring in her native tongue or staring with unfocused eyes at the station ceiling. The crystalline structures embedded in her skin gradually regained their luminescence, shifting from cloudy translucence to a clear, pale blue glow. Kale was checking her bandages when her eyes suddenly snapped fully open, alert and aware. She grasped his wrist with surprising strength, her claws extending slightly but not breaking his skin, a controlled warning rather than an attack. "Where am I?" she asked in perfect galactic standard, her voice melodious despite the underlying tension. "Seismic Monitoring Station S-12, Xylos," Kale answered calmly, making no attempt to pull away from her grip. "I found you after your Vessel crashed during the magnetic storm. You've been unconscious for 3 days. She released his wrist and attempted to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her healing injuries. The crystal fragments from my ship. Did you recover them? I brought you and what remained of your vessel. It was mostly disintegrated, but there are some fragments in storage. Lyra closed her eyes briefly, as if centering herself. They will be looking for the energy signature. We don't have much time. Who's that? Kale asked, folding his arms across his chest. And while we're at it, what did you mean when you called me Crystal Guardian? I'm just a station engineer. A faint smile touched Lyra's feline features. Is that what you believe? She gestured toward the small viewport where the distant crystal formations could be seen glowing faintly. Have you never wondered why the crystals respond when you're near? Why you were drawn to this desolate place when you could have hidden anywhere in the galaxy? Kale felt a chill that had nothing to do with Xylos's eternal winter. It was true that he'd experienced unusual phenomena around the crystal formations, echoing sensations that he'd attributed to the magnetic fields or his own isolation-induced imagination. Sometimes, standing at the edge of the Great Rift, he could almost imagine he heard whispers carried on the wind. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally, turning away to check the medical monitors. And you still haven't explained who's after you. The Void Collective, Lyra said, the name carrying a weight of dread. They seek the crystal energy for weaponization. My people, the Falarians, have protected the secret of crystalline communion for millennia, but our numbers dwindle. They destroyed our sanctuary moon 3 cycles ago. Few of us remain. She reached out, touching his arm lightly. The old record spoke of human bloodlines who could hear the crystal song, guardians who worked alongside Falarians to maintain the balance. I've spent my life searching for surviving guardians, following energy signatures across the galaxy. Her emerald eyes held his. The crystals on Xylos are ancient and powerful. They called to you, whether you recognize it or not. Before Kale could formulate a response dismissing her mystical explanations, the station's alarm system activated with a shrill wail. Multiple unidentified vessels detected entering Xylos' orbital space. Visa announced, her electronic voice even more distorted than usual. Communication systems detecting encrypted transmissions. Lyra's ears flattened against her head. They found us faster than I anticipated. She swung her legs off the medical bed, standing with visible effort. We need to reach the crystal sanctuary beneath the rift. It's our only chance. There's nothing under the rift but more ice, Kale protested, even as he moved to the station's monitoring systems to assess the threat. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 military-grade vessels entering atmosphere, their configurations unlike anything in standard registries. They moved with unnatural coordination, already adjusting their trajectory toward the station. The sanctuary is hidden from those who cannot hear its call, Lyra said, gathering the tattered remains of her original clothing. But we must hurry. The Void Collective will not hesitate to destroy everything to get what they seek. Kale's mind raced through options. His small emergency shuttle couldn't outrun military vessels. The station's defenses were minimal, designed to deter curious explorers or opportunistic scavengers, not withstand a coordinated attack. If Lyra was right, they would kill both of them without hesitation. There are old mining tunnels near the rift, he said finally, already moving to collect emergency supplies. Abandoned decades ago when the crystal deposits proved too unstable for commercial extraction. If your sanctuary exists, it might be accessible through them. As they hastily packed survival gear, medical supplies, and portable power cells, Kale found himself stealing glances at Lyra. Despite her injuries, she moved with fluid grace, her movements economical and precise. The crystals embedded along her spine pulsed more brightly as she worked, responding to her heightened emotional state. Why me, he asked suddenly. Even if I am somehow connected to these crystals, I'm nobody. A disgraced engineer hiding from my past. Not exactly guardian material. Lyra paused, her expression softening. The crystals don't recognize titles or past mistakes, Kale. They respond to something deeper, a resonance in your very essence. She touched the largest crystal embedded at the base of her neck. Just as my people don't choose our crystal bonds, they choose us. The proximity alarm interrupted them. The Void Collective ships had entered visual range. Through the station's main viewport, Kale could see 3 sleek, black vessels descending through the storm clouds, their hulls absorbing rather than reflecting light, giving them a disturbing void-like appearance. "Time to go," he said grimly, sealing his environmental suit and handing Lyra a spare that might approximately fit her unique physiology. "Let's hope these tunnels lead somewhere besides a dead end." They slipped out through the station's emergency exit just as the first energy signatures of weapons systems activated above. As they trudged through the snow toward the mining tunnels at the edge of the crystal rift, the sky behind them lit up with sickly purple energy. The station, Kale's home for 3 years, erupted in flames that burned eerily in the oxygen-poor atmosphere before being extinguished by the relentless cold. Kale felt oddly detached, watching his recent life literally go up in flames. Perhaps some part of him had always known his exile on Xylos was temporary, a pause rather than an ending. With each step toward the crystal rift, the faint whispers he'd ignored for years grew, incrementally louder in his mind, like a radio gradually being tuned to the right frequency. The entrance to the mining tunnels was partially collapsed, requiring them to dig through compacted snow and ice. As they worked, Lyra explained more about the Falarians and their connection to the crystal networks that spanned multiple star systems. "The crystals aren't just minerals," she said, her breath forming dense clouds in the freezing air. "They're semi-sentient energy matrices, living technology left by those who came before both our species. My people evolved a natural symbiosis with them over thousands of generations. Your bloodline was artificially bonded to them through ancient methods lost to time." "That's hard to believe," Kale grunted as he cleared away the last of the debris blocking the tunnel entrance. "If I had some special connection, wouldn't I know it?" "Not necessarily. The ability often remains dormant until awakened by proximity and need." She studied him thoughtfully. "The mining accident that brought you here, do you remember exactly what happened?" Kale stiffened. "I miscalculated the structural integrity of a crystal deposit. The tunnel collapsed. People died. Or perhaps the crystals reacted to your presence in ways the engineering models couldn't predict," Lyra suggested gently. "Untrained guardians can inadvertently disrupt crystal energy patterns." The implication hit Kale like a physical blow. If she was right, the disaster hadn't been his engineering error, but something more fundamental. An unknown ability he'd carried unknowingly. The thought was simultaneously horrifying and strangely relieving. Before he could process this revelation further, the ground trembled beneath them, impact tremors from weapons striking the surface nearby. The Void Collective was systematically targeting areas around the former station. "They're searching for us," Lyra whispered, her ears swiveling to track distant sounds. "We need to move deeper." The mining tunnels descended at a steep angle, ice gradually giving way to strange, striated rock embedded with crystal veins that emitted faint illumination. Kale led the way using his knowledge of mining structures, identifying supports and dangerous areas with practiced ease. The deeper they traveled, the stronger the crystalline glow became, providing enough light that they eventually switched off their portable lamps to conserve power. "The crystals are responding to our presence," Lyra observed, trailing her clawed fingers along a particularly bright vein. "Especially to you." Kale couldn't deny it any longer. The crystal formations brightened as he approached, dimming as he passed. More disturbingly, the whispers in his mind had become more distinct, though still incomprehensible, like overhearing a conversation in a language he almost but not quite understood. Hours into their descent, they encountered their first real obstacle, a massive cave-in blocking the main tunnel. As they searched for an alternate route, a skittering sound from behind caught their attention. Lyra's ears flattened against her skull as she spun toward the noise, dropping into a defensive crouch. From the shadows emerged a creature unlike anything Kale had seen on Xylos. A many-legged arthropoid the size of a large dog, its carapace embedded with crystal formations similar to Lyra's implants. Multiple compound eyes reflected their light sources as the creature assessed them with evident intelligence. Scuttler, Lyra whispered. They're native guardians of crystal formations. Normally they avoid outsiders. The creature chittered softly, the crystals on its back pulsing in patterns that seemed almost communicative. To Kale's shock, he felt an answering resonance from the crystal veins around them, and, more disturbingly, from something within himself. The scuttler turned and moved along a narrow side passage they hadn't noticed, pausing to look back at them expectantly. I think it wants us to follow, Kale said uncertainly. The crystal network communicates through all its connected vessels, Lyra explained, already moving after the creature. It recognizes what you are, even if you don't yet. The side passage twisted through increasingly bizarre geological formations. Columns of crystal that defied normal growth patterns, chambers where gravity seemed slightly altered, sections where the very air felt charged with potential energy. Throughout their journey, more ice scuttlers joined them, forming an honor guard of sorts that skittered alongside and sometimes ahead of them. During a brief rest in a chamber with potable water trickling down crystal formations, Lyra's ears suddenly perked up, swiveling toward the way they had come. They've entered the tunnel system, she said grimly. I can hear their energy weapons charging. Kale strained his ears, but heard nothing beyond the constant soft resonance of the crystals. How far behind? An hour, maybe less. They have tracking technology that attunes to crystal energy signatures. She touched the crystals embedded in her arm, which had begun pulsing more rapidly. Including mine. Then we keep moving, Kale said, helping her to her feet. Her injuries, though healing remarkably fast, still clearly pained her. As they continued deeper, Lyra shared more about her people and their conflict with the Void Collective. The collective had begun as a fringe scientific organization obsessed with harnessing void energy, the theoretical opposite of the crystal energy that powered much of advanced galactic technology. Their experiments had led them to discover that crystal energy could be inverted through a painful extraction process using living crystal-bonded beings like the Falarians. They don't just want the crystals, she explained as they navigated a particularly treacherous section where the floor had partially collapsed into a seemingly bottomless abyss. They want us, the biological interfaces that can communicate with the crystal network. Without a guardian or a Falarian, the crystals are just pretty rocks that emit energy. With us, they're keys to weapon systems that could destabilize the fabric of reality itself. The gravity of their situation settled heavily on Kale's shoulders. No longer was this just about his survival, or even Lyra's. The entire crystal network, spanning multiple systems, could be weaponized if the Void Collective captured them. After what felt like days, but was likely only about 14 hours of continuous travel, their unusual guides led them to an immense cavern that took Kale's breath away. The ceiling soared hundreds of meters overhead, embedded with massive crystal formations that cast the entire space in soft, multicolored light. At the center stood a structure that defied conventional architecture, a temple-like formation that appeared to have grown organically from the surrounding crystal, its spires and arches following patterns that pleased the eye yet couldn't be reduced to simple geometry. The crystal's sanctuary, Lyra breathed, her voice filled with reverent awe. I was beginning to fear it was just a legend. The ice scuttlers chittered excitedly, their crystal implants pulsing in synchronized patterns as they formed a pathway leading toward the sanctuary entrance. As Kale and Lyra approached, however, they encountered an invisible barrier, a shimmering energy field that prevented further progress. Only a true guardian can open the way, Lyra explained, stepping back respectfully. Place your hands on the threshold and listen to the crystal song. Kale hesitated, suddenly afraid. If he truly was what Lyra claimed, accepting this role meant abandoning his old identity completely. It meant acknowledging that everything he believed about himself, his skills, his failure, his exile, existed within a much larger context he'd been completely unaware of. "I don't know how to hear it," he admitted. "The whispers are just noise to me." Lyra stepped close, placing her hand on his chest over his heart. "Don't try to understand the words. Feel the rhythm. It's been singing to you since you arrived on Xylos. That's why you stayed all these years when you could have fled to any anonymous border world." Her emerald eyes held his. "Trust yourself, Kale. Trust what you've always felt but never acknowledged." Drawing a deep breath, Kale approached the barrier and placed both palms against the invisible field. At first, he felt nothing but a slight resistance and tingling against his skin. Then, gradually, the whispers that had haunted the edges of his consciousness coalesced into something more structured. Not quite language, but patterns he could somehow follow. Without conscious thought, his hands began tracing symbols on the energy field, movements that felt ancient and familiar though he'd never performed them before. The crystals embedded in the sanctuary entrance responded, glowing brighter and pulsing in rhythm with his movements. The barrier between them rippled like water disturbed by a stone. Suddenly, the energy field collapsed completely, revealing an open archway into the sanctuary's interior. The ice scuttlers chittered in what sounded remarkably like applause. "You did it," Lyra whispered, her eyes wide with wonder and vindication. "You truly are a guardian." Before Kale could respond, a violent tremor shook the cavern, sending small crystal shards raining from the ceiling. The ice scuttlers scattered in alarm, disappearing into hidden crevices. "They've found us," Lyra said urgently, already moving toward the open doorway. Quickly inside, they rushed into the sanctuary, finding themselves in a vast circular chamber dominated by a central column of pure crystal that rose from floor to ceiling. The crystal heart, pulsing with energy that made the air itself feel alive. Surrounding the heart were concentric rings of smaller crystal formations arranged in patterns that seemed to represent star systems or energy flows. "This is it," Lyra said, approaching the crystal heart reverently. "One of the nexus points of the entire network. From here, a guardian can communicate with and influence crystal formations across multiple systems." Kale was overwhelmed by the energy resonating within the chamber. The whispers had become a chorus, still not quite comprehensible, but somehow deeply meaningful. He felt connected to something vast and ancient, a web of consciousness that extended far beyond Xylos. His moment of wonder was shattered by a harsh voice echoing through the sanctuary entrance. "Impressive. You've saved us considerable effort by opening the way." A tall figure stepped into the chamber, flanked by soldiers in sleek black armor embedded with dull, inverted crystals that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. The leader wore no helmet, revealing a face that might once have been human but was now heavily modified with mechanical and crystalline implants. Most disturbing were his eyes, black voids with pinpricks of purple light where pupils should be. "Commander Vex," Lyra hissed, her furs standing on end. "Architect of the Falarian genocide." "Overseer Vex now," the figure corrected with a cold smile. "Thanks to the advancements your people's essence provided." He studied Kale with clinical interest. "And you found us a guardian. The last piece we need." Kale instinctively moved to place himself between Vex and the crystal heart. "Whatever you're planning won't work. I barely understand any of this myself." "Understanding is unnecessary," Vex replied, raising a hand to reveal a complex device embedded in his palm. "We simply need your biological resonance pattern. Extraction is, unfortunately, not survivable, but your sacrifice will fuel a new age of power." At his signal, the soldiers raised weapons that hummed with ominous energy. Lyra dropped into a fighting stance, the crystals along her spine glowing fiercely as she prepared to defend the heart. What happened next occurred too quickly for Kale to fully process. Vex activated his palm device, sending a beam of sickly purple energy toward the crystal heart. The moment it struck, the entire sanctuary shuddered, and Kale felt a searing pain lance through his mind as the crystal song distorted into screaming dissonance. Lyra launched herself at Vex with preternatural speed, but two soldiers intercepted her, their weapons firing beams that sliced through the air. She dodged with feline grace, but in her still weakened state, she couldn't evade completely. One beam caught her shoulder, sending her spinning to the ground with a cry of pain. Kale stood paralyzed, torn between rushing to Lyra's aid and protecting the crystal heart, which was beginning to pulse erratically under Vex's assault. The pain in his mind intensified, and with it came a sudden clarity, an understanding of the crystal song that had eluded him before. The crystals were screaming for help. They were alive, in their way, and Vex technology was torturing them, inverting their natural energy to create something corrupted and destructive. Instinctively, Kale placed his hands on the nearest crystal formation, shutting out the chaos around him. He didn't understand the science or mysticism behind what Lyra had told him, but he understood systems, energy flows, structural integrity, resonance patterns. If he was truly connected to these crystals, perhaps he could influence them the way he would recalibrate a mining laser or stabilize a collapsing tunnel shaft. He visualized the energy patterns he could now somehow perceive, identifying the disruption Vex was creating and mentally tracing alternative pathways to counteract it. The crystal beneath his palms warmed, its glow intensifying as it responded to his guidance. Around the chamber, smaller crystal formations began lighting up in sequence, creating a counterflow to Vex's extraction beam. The Overseer's expression changed from confident to concerned as his device sparked and fluctuated. "Kill him," Vex ordered his soldiers, pointing at Kale. Now, as the soldiers took aim, Lyra recovered enough to sweep the legs from under the nearest attacker. The cavern erupted into chaos. Weapons fire ricocheting off crystal surfaces, soldiers advancing, while Lyra fought with desperate ferocity to protect Kale as he maintained his connection to the crystal network. Through his link with the crystals, Kale sensed possibilities opening before him. He could feel the structural weak points of the sanctuary, the resonance frequencies that could trigger localized crystalline growth or collapse. With careful, deliberate thought patterns, he began manipulating these energies, not as weapons, but as barriers. Crystal formations erupted from the floor between the soldiers and their targets, forcing them back. Others grew across the sanctuary entrance, temporarily preventing reinforcements from entering. It wasn't fighting as much as strategic terraforming, using the living crystal's natural properties to create defensive structures. But Vex was not so easily deterred. Enraged by the resistance, he adjusted his extraction device to maximum power, creating a feedback loop that threatened to destabilize the entire crystal heart. "If I cannot control it, no one will," the Overseer snarled. "This entire system will become a void nexus once the heart shatters." The crystal song in Kale's mind became a warning siren. If the heart destabilized, the resulting energy release would not only destroy the sanctuary, but potentially crack Xylos itself, releasing a wave of corrupted crystal energy across the sector. Lyra met his eyes across the chamber, her fur matted with blood from fresh wounds, but her gaze clear and resolute. In that moment, Kale knew she understood the situation as well as he did. Without words, a plan formed between them. He would focus on stabilizing the heart while she dealt with Vex. With renewed determination, Kale redirected his efforts to the central crystal column, creating a protective resonance field around it. The effort was enormous, requiring every bit of concentration he could muster. Sweat poured down his face despite the cavern's chill as he worked to counter each distortion Vex created. Lyra, meanwhile, abandoned all pretense of self-preservation. She charged directly at Vex, absorbing weapons fire that would have killed a human instantly. The crystals embedded in her body glowed with blinding intensity as she drew upon their power, enhancing her speed and strength for one final assault. She reached Vex just as his device hit critical overload. The Overseer's eyes widened in shock as Lyra grabbed his wrist with both hands, forcing the extraction beam away from the heart and back toward its source. For a moment they struggled, locked in a contest of wills as much as physical strength. "This ends now," Lyra growled, her voice deepened by crystal resonance. With a final surge of effort, she twisted Vex's arm until the extraction beam pointed directly at the void crystals embedded in his chest. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The inverted energy cannibalized its source, creating a localized implosion that consumed Vex from within. His scream cut off abruptly as his body collapsed into nothing more than crystalline dust. But the victory came at terrible cost. The backlash of energy surged through Lyra, overloading her own crystal implants. She stumbled back, her body beginning to glow from within as crystal energy overwhelmed her biological systems. "No!" Kale shouted, maintaining his connection to the heart, but reaching toward her with his free hand. Lyra smiled sadly, her form already becoming translucent as the crystals in her body began absorbing her physical essence. "The sanctuary must be sealed," she managed, her voice distorted by the transformation overtaking her. "Complete the Guardian's oath, Kale. Protect the network." Before his eyes, Lyra's body dissolved into pure crystal energy, swirling like luminescent mist before being absorbed into the heart itself. As she disappeared, Kale felt her consciousness briefly touches through the crystal network, not gone, but transformed into something beyond physical form. With grief and rage fueling his determination, Kale turned his attention to the remaining Void Collective soldiers. Through his connection to the sanctuary, he triggered a final sequence of crystal growths, completely sealing the entrance and trapping the surviving enemies outside. Then, following instructions that seemed to flow directly from the heart itself, he initiated a sanctuary-wide harmonization that neutralized the corrupted energies Vex had unleashed. As the crystal song stabilized into peaceful harmony once more, Kale finally released his hold on the network and collapsed to his knees in exhaustion. In his palm, he found a small crystal fragment, warm to the touch and pulsing gently with the same emerald hue as Lyra's eyes. Somehow, he knew it contained a fragment of her essence, a final gift and reminder. Hours passed as Kale recovered his strength, communing with the crystal heart and learning more about his role as guardian. The sanctuary shared knowledge directly through the crystal song, which he could now interpret with growing clarity. He learned of the ancient pact between humans and Falarians, of the crystal network that spanned dozens of systems, and of his own heritage as descendant of a guardian bloodline long thought extinct. Most importantly, he learned that Lyra was not truly gone. Her consciousness had become part of the crystal network, her specific essence concentrated in the fragment he carried, but extending throughout the living crystal web that connected worlds. In time, with proper conditions and guidance, she might even be able to reform a physical body, though the process could take years. Days later, when Kale finally emerged from the now sealed sanctuary through a secondary passage revealed to him by the heart, he found Xylos subtly transformed. The perpetual magnetic storms had calmed, allowing the aurora to shine with unprecedented clarity. The crystal formations near the surface pulsed with renewed vigor, beginning the slow process of revitalizing the planet's long-dormant ecosystem. Standing at the edge of the great crystal rift, Kale held Lyra's crystal fragment against his heart, feeling its warm pulse synchronize with his own heartbeat. He was no longer the disgraced engineer hiding from his past, nor was he simply the mythical guardian of legend. He was both and neither, a man with a new purpose and understanding of his place in the universe. Using components salvaged from the mining equipment and his knowledge of crystal energy patterns, Kale constructed a small transmitter. Into it, he encoded a message modulated to the specific frequency used by Falarian crystal ships. Not a distress call, but an invitation and a promise. Somewhere in the vast galaxy, the scattered survivors of Lyra's people still existed, along with perhaps other dormant guardians unaware of their heritage. The message was simple yet profound. The crystal sanctuary of Xylos stands. A guardian watches over it. Those who seek balance are welcome. He added a subtle harmonic undertone that only crystal-attuned beings would recognize, a signature that contained echoes of Lyra's essence, proof that her sacrifice had not been in vain. In the months that followed, Kale established a new life for himself. The old monitoring station was beyond repair, but using crystal energy and his engineering skills, he constructed a modest dwelling near the sanctuary's hidden entrance. The ice scuttlers, once shy and elusive, now openly assisted him, bringing unusual plants and minerals from the deepest caverns that were slowly revitalizing under the sanctuary's influence. Through his deepening connection with the Crystal Heart, Kale learned to project his consciousness through the network, experiencing glimpses of other worlds where similar crystal formations existed. Sometimes, in these journeys, he sensed Lyra's presence guiding him, her consciousness dispersed but still individualized within the vast crystal web. These moments brought both comfort and renewed grief. The Void Collective had withdrawn after their leader's destruction, but Kale harbored no illusions that they had abandoned their quest. Through crystal-enhanced scanning systems he developed, he occasionally detected ships at the fringes of the system, observing, waiting. They would return eventually, perhaps with new technology or strategies. When they did, he would be ready. One evening, as twin moons rose over Xylos' transformed landscape, where patches of crystal-infused lichen now grew on once barren ice fields, Kale stood at the edge of the Great Rift, Lyra's crystal fragment warm against his chest. The auroras overhead had taken on new patterns since the sanctuary's reawakening, sometimes forming shapes that resembled Falarian script or ancient guardian symbols. "I'm still learning," he said aloud, knowing that in some way, Lyra could hear him through the crystal network. "But I'm not running anymore." The fragment pulsed in response, its glow intensifying momentarily. Through his connection to the sanctuary, Kale sensed a wordless reassurance, a reminder that he was not truly alone, even in his solitary vigil. As he turned to walk back to his dwelling, a new sound caught his attention, a faint harmonic resonance in the upper atmosphere, distinct from Xylos' natural frequencies. Focusing his enhanced senses upward, Kale detected a small ship entering orbit, its design unlike any in common usage, but faintly reminiscent of Lyra's crystalline vessel. A response to his transmission had come sooner than expected. Whether it brought allies, other refugees, or new challenges remained to be seen. But as Kale squared his shoulders and prepared to greet whatever arrived, he felt something he had not experienced since before the mining disaster that had sent him into exile, a sense of purpose, of belonging to something greater than himself. The crystal fragment at his chest pulsed once more, and this time he clearly sensed Lyra's consciousness touching his own through their shared connection to the living crystal. Not words, but emotions, approval, encouragement, and something deeper that transcended simple categorization. Together, then, Kale murmured, watching the approaching ship's trajectory with calm readiness rather than anxiety. Whatever comes next. Above him, the auroras of Xylos shifted into new configurations, as if the planet itself acknowledged the beginning of a new chapter. The Crystal Guardian had awakened, the sanctuary was secure, and the ancient balance between worlds had found a new champion. The galaxy was changing, and from this forgotten ice world on the fringes of known space, that change would spread, like ripples through the crystal network that connected all things.